So yeah, I work for OpenBudgets, which is a project of the Open Knowledge Foundation Germany. We're funded by the EU, which is fairly ironic, seeing that we've done a lot of budget transparency research and work also towards the EU. And seeing that today's topic was, or this Republica's topic is reconnecting Europe, I felt that this was pretty well suited to present here. And yesterday already I got into a lot of talks about the Brexit, and in any talk that we have around the EU, finances, money flows, squandering EU money is usually one of the first things that come up. And at the same time, in our project, in my research and in my project, we noticed we just don't know a whole lot yet. So that's why I thought, let's do a quick run through, and I will try to use the Brexit debate, and if we hear about the Brexit bill and what they are negotiating, and if they are going to pay 0 or 100 billion, where that comes from, and I will try to kind of use that as a red thread through this presentation, so that you have a bit of an understanding, well, what are they actually fighting about. And finally, I do want to say about also the reconnecting part, because we have done, if we look at the debates, especially around money flows in Europe, it's always about we pay too much, there is, like, where is this money going? It's usually in the discourse of more the Eurosceptic parties, whereas research of the European Council for Foreign Relations actually shows that the biggest chunk of the EU's subsidies and grants, and the biggest chunk of the EU budget goes to European structural and investment funds, and these are actually quite effective when for cohesion and connecting Europe and connecting Europeans. So these are the two things that I want to touch upon. First, I will quickly say something about revenues, some basics, the two budgets that the EU has, show you the overall budget, and then dig into the subsidies and grants. And then, as promised, something on the Brexit, and maybe somewhat more on cohesions. So what is the EU budget? Where does it consist of? So the first thing I need to say here is the EU budget is different than any other budget, in the sense of a governmental budget usually has social spending, healthcare spending, pensions. The EU budget is a completely different vehicle when it comes to that, because the EU as a governmental institution is different. So where does the money come from? Three resources. One is customs for the EU internal market, VAT, that is partially levied by the member states that they then transfer to the EU, and the biggest chunk, about 96% of the entire budget, comes from the membership fees, or as they see it in Germany, a tax that they levy for the EU, whereas in the Netherlands or in Britain, it was always seen as the contribution to the EU, which was by all means too much. And that accounts for roughly, it's recalculated every year how much it is, because there are different ceilings. But in 2015, it was 0.66% of the GNI. And that's the gross national income. So then, especially the bigger member state countries, and actually mainly the UK, found that it paid too much. So they have a really complicated system, which I won't get into, with which the EU got a rebate already back in the 80s, of which they paid on less. In this rebate, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and Sweden said, but we don't want to pay more. And this, what the UK pays less is divided over the other member states, and they pay a bit more. Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and Sweden didn't really feel like that, so they don't. And that is again spread over the other member states. And then finally, Ireland, Denmark, and the UK have a little bit less, but really minor, because they are not part of Schengen. The EU revenue streams. As you see, this is Germany pays about 20%, the UK about 15%, France about 15%. You just got to, it looks a lot like that one country is paying 1/5 into the budgets, but also Germany is the biggest economy of the European Union. So it is really based on GNI, and that is why at first glance, you see this, you think like this is a major difference, and that goes especially if you think of the national politicians discussing the budget. Then if you see a picture like this, it's like, why do we have to pay 1/5? Why do? Or I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, we're such a tiny country. Why do we almost pay 5.8%, etc., etc.? So that works well for a bit of a Eurosceptic discourse. But as I already said, it's a completely different budget than we think about. So how much is it? It is 154 this year for 2017. It's 154,505 million. That is, it will be raining millions and billions in this talk. And to give you an idea how much money that is, I honestly still myself have no imagination how much money that could be. But as per comparison, to give you some comparison, the big tech giants, Apple has an annual revenue of 248 billion. You have Google, or actually Alphabet plus Google are around, I looked it up yesterday, around just around 120,000 million. Ireland has a much smaller budget, I looked up this morning, and I don't have my speaker's notes, so I'm going to do that by heart, this number rain. I think Ireland, I looked up, was, help me here, something around 67 million. But for example, the Netherlands again goes way up in the 200,000 million. So Ireland has 6,700 million. So to give you an idea, it's within the, so it's if the EU was a big tech company, it would be a really big tech company. It would play with big guys. In budgetary terms, it's bigger than Ireland, but it's much smaller than Germany, and it's somewhere around these levels. That's how you have to understand this figure. And as I said before, it's a completely different budget in the sense of what it provides us. In the sense of it's mainly investment and subsidy programs and a little bit of administration, although it's often portrayed, especially with the European Parliament still moving from Brussels to Strasbourg every month, it is really portrayed as administration costs so much that is, we will see in a minute, a really tiny bit of the budget. And then other things that we hear a lot about EU finance, like the stability mechanisms and the bailout constructions, these are not on this budget. That is payments between countries. I do budget research for Germany, for the International Budget Partnership. That's where I find the loan guarantees. You don't find that on the European budget. So, and now the last things on the budget basics then, and I hope everyone still follows me. If you have questions in between, let me know. So how the EU budget works is actually you have two. We usually say the EU has two budgets. What they say themselves is we have a framework and an annual budget, however you want to call it. Every 7 years, there is an enormous procedure to set the priorities and set the framework for, which is called the multi-annual financial framework. Now we are in the middle of this period, which runs from 2014 to 2020. And what this does is this framework sets the priorities and the maximum spending per heading. And these headings will then give you roughly the priorities, but kind of in management speak, right? Smart and inclusive growth, Sustainable growth, natural resources. So basically what I always do is kind of remember smart green jobs. That's roughly the priorities of the EU. So they're so widely formulated that you, and these are then the 6 headings, and per heading there are all kind of maximums and regulations. And then the annual budget is set every year again, together with Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, and that runs then yearly and has basically 1/7 of the entire multi-annual financial framework that is set. So to give you an overview of the numbers, I got that from the EU budget page to give you kind of a feel for how much we're talking about. So one heading has 500, one of the biggest headings, smart and inclusive growth, which funds a lot of these subsidies, a lot of these grant schemes that the EU has, funds 513,563 million euros, and then per year you speak about a bit more than 73,000 millions. So that is the amount, the numbers that we're talking about, and then I want to quickly go into heading 5. Although I just said that is usually where the part where it is a really small part of the overall budget, as you can see here, but it is one that gets a lot of attention, and because this is where Brussels spends the money, so to say. And with my project OpenBudgets.eu, one of our partners is Transparency International EU. And within that, because indeed, I mean, there is an entire extra level of government created, and it is very far removed, so to say, from our other accountability measures that we have in terms of if you go to your national parliament, etc., etc. So so it is important that we have a look at exactly what, for example, MEPs spend, and how internally within these institutions that the money is well allocated. So what my colleague Nika Yossi from Transparency International EU has been doing is running this MEP expenses campaign. The MEPs get allowances, get allowances for 4,000 a month. That accounts for 40 million a year. And over these 4,000, they don't have to hand in any receipts. It's just they get it. But there are rules that they get this money to rent office spaces in their home constituencies to keep these links between Brussels and their home constituencies. And now a newspaper from Denmark found that they are supposed to be used for local rent, found that 249 of these offices are not there. But, I mean, no one's giving that money back. It's an allowance where you don't have to give any declarations for. Also, more and more, we've seen that more and more research in these allowances and expenses of members of European Parliament are, it shows that costs are not declared correctly, or in this case, they are maybe not used, but where they disappear to, we don't know. In other cases, we know, although it's not allowed, that it might be used to not for the Member of Parliament himself, but to kind of cross-finance the local or the national party, which the Member of Parliament is a member to, which is also not allowed. But we don't know all that exactly because they don't have to hand in any receipts. And on the millions and billions range that I spread out over here, it seems very small. It's 40 million a year, but the mere fact that it goes unaccounted, that is where we have campaigned for, and we now have a big push. And the latest is that finally the Parliament itself agreed last April to change these rules to also make declarations on this one. So that's a really successful push and outcome when it comes to lobbying on more transparency and accountability on the level of the institutions and the Parliament. Now, the second thing that we did was lobby, of course, was work on transparency of the big sums. because I will now go back quickly to explaining how the grants and subsidies are divided, and then I get to our project Subsidies Stories, where we try to trace these down all the way to the local level so that we understand better how EU money is being spent on the local level. So, how does it work? I borrowed this picture because I haven't been able to visualize this better myself, as it is a very, very complex system. So what we see here is, as I just said, we have several headings, which all got to do with smart growth green jobs. And these different headings are then translated in priorities and programs, which follow the same language of smart growth green jobs. These are then managed either by the Commission and by the Directorate Generals, which are the ministries of the Commission, so to say, or go to the member states and management authorities within the member states. And they then decide on the exact programs, and those are those calls where also my organization, and maybe others here in the room as well, apply to. That can be research funding, that can be your local community center, that can be even a subsidy for a small training, or if you're really smart, you can even have these subsidies to renovate your house and make it climate neutral. I've also seen subsidies for that. So that's the kind of, that's then when it trickles all the way down. But what we found when we dug into this is that we can't actually trace it all the way down yet. I will come to that later. Now on how this exactly works for the biggest funds, that's the European Structural and Investment Fund, to drill it down a bit for you. So basically you have this major heading, European Structural and Investment Fund. But actually that applies to 5 different funds, which are in turn managed by 4 different DGs. Once these DGs then go into negotiation with the member states about exactly which programs they're going to fund for how much, and how much of the subsidies are coming from the European Union, and how much from the member states. And then these management authorities themselves, they select the projects, they manage it, they oversee them, give out the payments, report back to the EU, and they should publish the information. And that's important because I will get back to that. There are some rules and regulations who is entitled to what. The cohesion funds only go to member states with average, which have a lower GNI than 90%. Only 10 minutes left? Oh, it's perfect. It's probably fine. The other one is, for member states, mostly in Eastern Europe and in Spain, that's where you have the cohesion funds, literally taking care of cohesion in the sense of subsidizing loads of infrastructure, communication, and the other one is the regional, the European Regional and Development Fund and the European Social Fund. The European Social Fund is, as I just said, loads of training, loads of social programs for people with disabilities, for against unemployment, training programs, and the European Regional Development Fund is much more for programs. Basically, if you go on holiday right here in Europe, then you see basically almost every cultural building has a small EU flag on it. These kind of restorations are an investment, especially in the region, can be funded over the ERDF. So the European Union themselves, on the high level, on how much is going to the member states, have this website called Cohesion Data. If you're interested in this stuff, I have all the links at the end of my slideshow, and I'm happy to show them to you. And as you can see here, the total for all these 5 funds is 638 billion. I'm not going to go down all that, right? And as you see here, roughly, is the division then per country. And kind of linking it back to our Brexit, because is, for example, the United Kingdom receives from the European Union over all these subsidies, because the United Kingdom actually receives quite a bit of subsidies. Because on the regional level, if we go back here, you see that many of the regions are actually what they call transition regions, or regions actually in Wales, for example, with low development, in the sense that they get a lot of co-financing, actually get a lot of subsidies. This is something with the Brexit that they are certainly going to lose. And we're still researching it, but we also suspect a correlation between these regions and actually the vote no, and these regions that did get a lot of subsidies, which is a bit paradoxical. Anyway, as you see here, Poland is definitely the biggest recipient, and it's easily explained. It has low economic development as compared to the average EU, and is secondly, after Germany, the biggest EU country, most inhabitants. So there you go. It has, and through all these kind of measures, the subsidies are divided, and that provides them in absolute terms with the highest rate of subsidies overall. And you see the United Kingdom being at slightly over 30 billion. But that's only the part that they get from the EU. Since there are co-financing systems, for the United Kingdom, a bit under 50% need to be co-financed. For Poland, for example, with a lower GNI average as compared to the average EU, is only 20% need to be co-financed, these kind of things. But that's when we get to all the nitty-gritty details. And we try to get to the nitty-gritty details with Subsidy Stories. So what we did is try and understand, how is this money actually spent on the ground? And it turned out that all the different data was in slightly more than 150 different data sets around easy over 60 websites all over Europe, and in all kind of different formats. And we try to standardize it, and we have collected it all on Subsidy Stories. And through what we hoped to get out was having this overview, having this visualization, and through that, increasing transparency of EU spending. So actually asking the question, how is this actually being spent on the regional or the local level? Where is this money going to? So what, as I said, we had to collect it, download it. Major obstacles were language obstacles, of course, because they're not standardized even in languages. Then we had to do loads of scraping and cleaning, and try and get a minimum standard, and create a model so that we could compare and unify. Here is an example from Ireland, and Ireland is actually a really good example of how difficult it is. We're still not done with the data set for Ireland, so to say, in the sense that we don't have all the projects and spending that's been done in Ireland. We've been endlessly emailing back and forward about these different data sets. Apparently, we also broke their websites by scraping them. They weren't so happy. And then we got really pissed emails eventually that we displayed it all wrong, and that we weren't giving the right information, and then we got the right data sets, but without what we asked for. So the general priorities that you can also find at the cohesion websites of the EU itself, and what we wanted to know is, how is it spent on projects? And that information they haven't given us. For some projects they do, or for some funds they do, but if it's another management authority, they don't. So even for Ireland, which seems, it's not a big country, it's not like in Germany, it's also a mess. At least there we talk about different Bundesländer, and here in Ireland, you have in principle 4 or 5 different regions I needed to write, but it just doesn't get together. We don't get it together. So for Ireland, for example, we have very little projects actually in our database. It's not complete. We have these major disclaimers. The first findings actually, what we do know, and we can't make conclusions about the actual spending on project level because we don't have it all, and we haven't managed to get it all together. But what is, there were some oddities that struck. One is there seems to be a practice of overbooking. The other one is there's a lot of public institutions in that database. So what we expected, and also what the EU promotes, is that it's about supporting small, medium-sized enterprises and this and that. Well, just you can literally Google your own run your own municipality name through our database. Maybe not for Ireland because it's not complete, but there you see loads of public institutions and even municipalities in there. Comparison, as said, is very, very difficult. Different currencies. But finally, what really was really funny to see also is that there's projects in there that go over €1 billion for a highway versus projects of €2,000 for a training somewhere in the countryside in Germany. So there's loads of different, it's just a very, within one type of subsidy, and within one type of grant, there is such a difference in what is funded with this money. So it's really, really interesting to keep on digging into. Our lessons learned from this first attempt to get it all together is that we needed major disclaimers. The transparency of these projects and of this funding, we find it striking that this is something that we had to try to do. And that it is not standardized, and that the European Commission doesn't have this data, or at least is not publishing it. Definitely transparency and insight in this. I've been talking about this now for about half an hour. I probably have lost quite a number of you talking about this complexity of how these funds are divided. And I've only touched the surface because it's much more messy once you ask a concrete question like, how much is Google receiving subsidies? Could very well be. We know, for example, in Germany, we've run things like seeing how much Siemens, which is also a multinational, if they receive subsidies, and sure, they're in there. And then if we want to know why they got that money, how they got that money, it turns out you have to go all the way down to the precise call, and that's how complex it gets. So that's certainly a hindrance to transparency. And the spread of the data, of course, makes it really, really difficult to compare between countries, and that's exactly where you want it to have, right? Because it's very, very interesting to see why is, if you would see that that is exactly what you want to know. If in your region you don't get your community-centered funded because they have a maximum on it, and it turns out that in the next region in Ireland they don't. That's the kind of then you would be like, that feels unjust, and these kind of things. You want to get that out, but there is we cannot know that right now because we cannot do this. We cannot do this comparison. And finally, we are wondering who has the oversight at the European Commission. So the DG region is publishing this data on the member state level and on the program and priorities level, but the European Auditing Commission is or the High Court of Auditors of the European Union looks at the different programs, but who is actually having oversight? There must be someone who has all this data together, or at least we hope. Mm-hmm. So what we really need is more transparency on cohesion and spending on and EU spending on the local level, because at the very same time that there is usually these myths around squandering of money. There is, at the same time, cohesion funds, the cohesion monitor from the European Council of Foreign Relations, show that exactly this kind of projects actually contribute to people actually seeing the EU also doing a lot of good things. So it actually does help. We just don't know that these are happening, and we don't have enough insight. Last note on Brexit, and then I'm done. So on Brexit, it's fairly straightforward. If we look at these 7-year, if we get back to our, so it's fairly straightforward. As I said, the 2014-2020 line, that's basically what the budget division for the multi-annual financial framework is. And then in 2017, that's a breakdown basically of that. That's all contracts. That's all. These are all commitments and payments that are made every year. It's about half commitment, half payment for every budget. And these are, and also for the subsidies, these are actually contracts and grant agreements between the Commission and the UK that are already made. And the UK agreeing back then in 2013 to the MFF that consists a commitment of paying into it all the way to 2020. And since the multi-annual financial framework also includes commitments beyond 2020 for policies and programs that go beyond the running time or that are rounding off, it would be until around 2020, 2023 that these commitments for Britain are there. That is roughly what is the expectations. Like there is roughly this, it's already in law. And they've signed this. It's a contract that they can't breach even when the membership stops. Then the question is, then there is a big question, and that's why you hear so many different numbers. Will the rebate still apply? This lowered discount, basically, that they get on their membership fee. And so different versions and forms on the Brexit debate and the different expectations. I would like to point you to the Brogo report to get an idea on that. So and they get to an estimate of around 50 billion euros. So finally, interesting links, and that's done that.
Wow.
Sorry if I completely
wow.
showered you with numbers.
Right. Well, I don't know if you can tell, but Brexit, it does impact me somewhat, being English, although I now live in Ireland, but I still feel sorry for the poor souls left back over in England. And to hear all of that, and the fact that we're committed for another couple of years after we finish as well, possibly up to 2023, it's just such a mess.
So how that works is that there is how it works. You have annual payments towards the EU. They're currently negotiating, so these annual payments continue. And with that, it's not an absolute number.
No.
Every time. So in total, the UK committed to their share of the multi-annual financial framework. With every payment again, it reduces. That's basically it.
Well, just like my mortgage.
Exactly.
Just a really
yeah, basically.
Does anybody have any questions? Whoa, yes.
Oh.
Right. I'm not surprised, to be honest. Right. Can I have your name, please?
Hi, I'm Nikki. Thanks so much for the talk. I just had a question about the divorce bill. So I know that recently it's been in the news, like this week, I think, like David Davies and Boris Johnson are trying their best to wriggle out of paying any divorce bill, it would appear. But my question is, because I don't know too much about this, I just wanted to know if maybe you knew a bit more. Because you said that they were contracted in law already to sort of pay a certain amount that's been forecast in the future, but that's under EU law. Is Britain trying to wriggle out in the sense of being like, well, EU law will no longer apply to us? And like, do you know anything about that? And is that even?
Would that even?
Yeah, would that even be possible? I mean, for me, it seems like that would be ridiculous, but it seems to be where they're maybe going. Not sure.
That's a really interesting perspective on it. So I must be very honest, just to because I had so many Brexit discussions yesterday. I looked it up and tried to kind of, with all the base knowledge that I already have on the EU budget, I was like, I can't talk about the EU budget without addressing the Brexit, right? That would be odd. So that's why I added it. And so basically what they say in the Bogle report there is that the paying zero, and even Davis, the head negotiator, is, yes, it's again a bit of a political discourse to say we might want to pay nothing. But that is, even previously it's been said, like that's probably, it's not very realistic that would happen. And then, but it's much more of a kind of, these negotiations, are they going to take place within the framework kind of the EU law? Or are they going to take place in the sense of the EU as the legal person negotiating contracts or agreements, treaties with the UK as a legal person? But even then you get to international contract law. And if you've made a commitment in a very similar way, that if you've made a commitment to the UN to pay X amount in memberships fees towards certain programs, etc., etc., etc. I mean, this goes beyond a membership fee, so to say, in the sense that these are running commitments for policies and programs that are being implemented at this very moment. So that's, yeah, it has enormous financial implications.
Thank you very much. And just give your name, please.
Hi, my name is Sam. My question is, if the UK has this commitment to continue paying to 2020, has the EU a commitment to keep doing these programs for the UK until 2020? And
they have
doing
already,
the subsidies until then?
They have already pledged to that commitment, so yeah.
Good question. Are there any other questions? Oh, yep, last one.
Hello, Lars. I mean, you mentioned that the UK can't, I don't know, break the commitment. Of course they can. Because it's a contract, right? Per definition, you can don't obey whatever was in there. What are the mechanisms to? Because to me, I mean, until 2020 sounds like a bit, but it's just a few months, right? So this is, it's not just like, what is it, 7 or 8 months? So that's not the problem. It's more like, if you think about, you mentioned like 2023. Mm-hmm. This is where it gets a bit more complicated. Okay. To me, it's a reputational question, because if the EU had to enforce something between 2023, I guess there's no legal precedence for doing that. So my question would be, what mechanism can the EU actually use to enforce that commitment?
So quickly on these, so every budget has commitments and payments. And the EU budget is roughly put up like this, that there is every year in the executed budget, you see that there is around roughly half our commitments, because if you enter into a policy, and it's also for your national budget that way, has all kind of, so we go down a bit in budget nerdydom, but stay with me. So basically, if you have, normally a budget is not a table, right? It's a big book. In Germany, it's 6,000 pages. I don't know how hefty it is here, but these things are hefty. They have different chapters for different ministries, basically, and then it is broken down per department, and the different policies and programs that they are running then have titles and are drilled down. And from these different policies, because there's almost no policy that only runs for a year, right? There is commitments coming from that that are then already put in the budget. So you have a policy, it says in 2017, this is what is planned for this, and then from this policy follows the commitments in 2018, 2019, etc., etc. So if a program starts in 2018 or 2020 and it runs for, say, and in rounding of the budget of, and in rounding of a multi-annual financial framework, there is normally a 2-year grace period in which all the payments are still being made. So the commitments are then already there, and the payments are still being made in the sense that in the end of the day, all these subsidies and grants are going into projects that are implemented on the ground. People then have to literally round off their project. So if a 3-year project starts in 2018, it will finish in 2021. Then they're rounding off. They hand in all their receipts in 2021, maybe 2022. So only then the payment's being made. So that is where this additional, where such an additional, if it's agreed to, that if it is agreed, of course, that they have to keep on paying into the current multi-annual financial framework, that is where such why then certain commitments made, for example, in 2020, are run over into payments in 2021, 2022, 2023. It's budgetary nerdydom.
This is such a massively compelling topic, isn't it? And it has such an impact on Europe overall, but Ireland massively. And we're still weeding out what's going to happen exactly with borders and with trade and with taxation. So yes, I'm not surprised that this has had some very deep delving questions. I have to say the light green and white writing has really made it kind of mellow learning.
Okay, I'm happy about that. I would say for everyone who wants to know more, I was massively impressed by the Bruegel report that they wrote about it. It gives different scenarios, different payment schemes, bombards you with numbers again. Yeah. It gives you an idea against the legal background, what are all the different possibilities, basically. But the first sentence is so incredibly important, is, like most believe, this divorce bill is not the most important thing in the whole Brexit debate. Because in the end of the day, it's again, in comparison to the negotiations about the trade agreements, this is peanuts.
Yeah, this is nothing in comparison.
This is nothing, and it's again how this game is played. Again, if we go back in general to how the debates about the European Union are framed, that things that are in comparison, not the biggest issue, but the moment they are about having to pay into the European Union, they are then blown up and centralized.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Anna. Really appreciate you coming out today to explain this for us. Thank you so much for your amazing questions and for your patience today. And that is the end of today's session.